Planet Earth, 100 million years from now. It's hot and humid, and most of the planet is covered in forest and swamp. Life is very different in this future world. Most of the mammals have gone, replaced by giant reptiles. Over the last 95 million years, since the end of the last great ice age, the world has been gradually warming up. And in these conditions, evolution runs riot. The forests, swamps, and oceans are crammed with life. Tens of millions of species, all competing for food and living space. Evolution acts like an arms race. Attack and defense, measure and countermeasure, alliance and partnership. And as creatures battle to survive in this future hothouse world, evolution has created some very bizarre relationships. In 100 million years' time, planet Earth looks very different. 90% of the globe is underwater, and much of what was once dry land is covered by shallow seas only 20 meters or so deep. A great saltwater flood crept very slowly over the low-lying regions of the continents. The map of the globe is unrecognizable. And this strange future world is also warmer than today because of a massive greenhouse effect. The rise in temperature and the rise in sea level are both caused by the same process, a global increase in volcanic activity. Volcanoes pump out huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, trapping the sun's heat. As the world warms up, the ice caps start to melt. As all the ice on the planet melts, huge amounts of water are added to the oceans, which raises the sea level. And in the hothouse climate, the water is warmer. Warm water expands, so the oceans occupy more volume and sea levels rise even further. But volcanoes have one more major effect on sea levels. Most volcanoes are created where the plates forming the Earth's outer shell grind against each other. And there are times in the Earth's story when the movement of these plates speeds up.
When we have very rapid movement of plates, it means an enormous amount of new molten material is being added to the margins of the plates, normally at mid-oceanic ridges. And the result of both the rising water material and its less dense nature is that the bottoms of the oceans next to the mid-oceanic ridges bulge up. If these bulge up, they displace the water from the ocean basins off onto the continents. It's as though you took your tub and you started to push up on the bottom of the tub, and ultimately a tub full of water will flow out over the margins to either side.
Warm, sunlit seas are ideal conditions for life. And evolution can run wild. Shoals of young reef gliders, a kind of swimming sea slug, feed and grow in the shallow water. And in turn, they draw in predators. Almost invisible, but deadly to the reef gliders. An ocean phantom.
The ocean phantom is an enormous floating jellyfish. It's not just any kind of jellyfish, though. It's a specialized jellyfish called a siphonophore. And 100 million years from now, it's the largest creature floating in the oceans. But in today's seas, we have large siphonophores. They're called Portuguese men-of-war, and they're made up of not just one jellyfish, but a whole collection, a colony of individual smaller jellyfish that play different roles in the colony. And some of them are used for catching food, and some of them are used for digesting food, and some of them are used for propulsion, and some of them are used for making babies.
So what looks like a single creature is really a floating colony of individuals all working together. In the future, the much larger ocean phantom has a more organized structure. Specialized polyps on the upper side form stiffened sails that can even change angle to catch the wind. The whole colony is kept afloat by a raft of large polyps filled with gas. And hung from beneath the raft, a variety of other polyps, including bell-shaped mouths ringed with primitive eyes that can see their prey underwater. So the phantom isn't one creature. It's a colony of different kinds of individuals of the same species. But the phantom has also formed a partnership, a symbiosis, with a very different species. Sea spiders, spindle troopers, live inside specialized bells hanging underneath the phantom. The phantom feeds the spindle troopers by secreting food into the bells. In exchange, the spindle troopers defend their host against a deadly enemy, an adult reef glider. These giant sea slugs are fattened on the rich food over the shallow reefs. They reach up to 1.5 meters long and nearly half a ton in weight. And when they can, they feed on ocean phantoms. But then, the spindle troopers swing into action. The spindle troopers use their sharp jaws to irritate the sea slug, and eventually it gives up and retreats to find less well-defended prey. The reefs that feed the young reef gliders are very different from today's. It would seem that such warm, shallow water would be ideal for coral. But there are no coral reefs anywhere in this future world.
when there's great change in the oceanic circulation or temperature, composition, corals are one of the first groups to disappear. So it's not surprising that corals have gone extinct. But the niche for a coral, the place of life for something that grows like a coral, still exists. And so it's not surprising here in the future that some other organism has stepped into this slot. And the organism that has stepped into this slot is a red alga. Now, actually, red algae have made reefs before. They were very important many times in the past, and they have simply come out of eclipse to take over again in the absence of corals. But this red algae is doing something very different.
Between their fronds, the algae produce strange cone-like structures that attract young reef gliders. And they do this to solve a major problem.
In the future, when red algae make huge reefs, they have to face the same problem that red algae have had to face their entire history. And that's that when they reproduce, their sperm cells can't swim. They can only crawl from one individual to another, and across huge reefs, that's just too far. So these red algae need help.
That help comes from young reef gliders. Attracted by the reward of a secretion rich in protein, they're coated with the algae's spores as they feed, then carry them from plant to plant as they move round the reef. This kind of partnership has happened before, and it was a great success. The partnership between insects and flowers. Flowering plants bribe insects with sugary nectar to carry pollen between plants. This alliance works so well that both insects and flowering plants have become very successful. Often, the relationship is so close that some flowers have evolved to work only with one kind of insect.
The combined evolution of different organisms, one to the other and then the other responding, that's what we call coevolution. It happens all the time, and it's particularly common when habitats are stable, they last a long time, and organisms have a great swath of time to adjust to one another back and forth and back and forth.
So red algae and reef gliders both gain from this partnership, giving them both an edge in this competitive world. But survival is more than just finding food. It's also a battle against the elements. Warm oceans generate storms, and these future seas are warmer than today, so storms are more powerful, more violent, and more frequent. All the Phantom can do is lower its sails and try to ride out the storm. Battered by the wind and waves, the Phantom is ripped to pieces. It looks like a disaster. But as long as each piece has enough members of each kind of polyp and a few spindle troopers, it can survive and grow back to full size. These warm, shallow seas might look like paradise, but they're not. They're a brutal evolutionary battleground.
100 million years of evolution is going to make a crowded ocean. There's going to be a lot of organisms, a lot of species, a lot of predators, and perhaps not much prey. Having a lot of predators is one very good reason for escaping an environment and moving to a new one. Not having enough to eat is also a very good one, and either one could drive colonization and exploration of new environments.
One way to escape the crowded seas is to move out of the water. The rising sea levels have created vast areas of hot, humid swamp. Perfect for marine creatures to experiment with life on land. These are swampers, a type of octopus, and they seem to have no trouble hauling themselves onto land and across the swamp.
Now we know that even modern-day octopuses can do that. If you've ever seen one escaping from a marine tank, it'll climb up the corner and down the side and across the floor and back into the sea. So just by pulling themselves arm by arm along, we know that octopuses can deal with a terrestrial mode of locomotion. But one thing that a modern octopus can't do right now is breathe out of the water, and that's one of the major adaptations that these swamp octopuses will have had to have invented.
Inside the mantle, there's a special chamber lined with a rich supply of blood vessels. It's like a lung, so the swampus absorbs oxygen directly from air. In the hot, humid atmosphere, this primitive lung works so well that the swampers can spend days out of the water. A stable, hot, humid climate is ideal for vegetation. There's an explosion of plant growth. With plants this rich and luxurious, there's bound to be a large herbivore. A very large herbivore. This is a tortoise. It's a giant tortoise, the size of an elephant, and this one is only a baby. Lumbering monsters like this are one of the hazards of life on dry land in this massive swamp. But if it strays too close, the swampers can defend themselves. Like some octopus today, the swampus has a venomous bite, powerful enough even to kill a tortoise. But the swampers weren't just defending themselves. They were defending this plant that has a deep well of water at the center, and hidden in the well is a baby swampus. This plant is their nursery. The adult swampers feed their young with fish they've brought from the swamp.
Well, you would think that the octopus could perhaps just guard its young in the swamp, but the swamp is a dangerous place. There's threats all over. It's much easier to invent a simple solution of taking the young out of danger's way and putting them in a safe haven on the land.
So by clustering them all together within what amounts to a nursery inside of this vase, the adult octopuses, which have a venomous bite, can gather around and protect the young octopi. They can bring in food to feed to them and, in a sense, keep an eye on them.
This is yet another example of a co-evolutionary relationship.
In a co-evolutionary relationship, each side must benefit from the relationship. Each must gain something.
The octopus gain a secure nursery for their young. But what does the plant gain?
The plant has timed its flowering so it occurs at the same time when the octopi are nursing their young, which means that when the flower stalk emerges from the center of this large bowl, that no herbivore is going to bother it because there are the guardian octopi around the outside guarding their young. You may think that we have just invented a piece of science fiction. No, all we've done is change the players and shown you something that's going on at this very instant on this planet now.
Today, in the rainforests of Jamaica, bromeliads trap water at the base of their leaves. A particular freshwater crab uses these private pools for breeding, raising its young in safety, away from the predators that lurk in forest streams and pools. So the crab gains a safe nursery. A female crab catches food for her babies, and the crab's waste products are absorbed by the plant, so the plant also gains. In the future, it's not so easy. Nursery plants are rare in the swamp, but a female swampus can't breed without one. This female is searching for a plant of her own. But this plant is defended by a whole family of swampers of several generations. As well as waving at each other, they use color changes to show how intimidating they can be. Female octopus let their daughters use the plant. In return, they help to defend the nursery. A partnership between generations. Another way of cooperating in a crowded swamp. The swampers rear their young in the safety of the plant because the dark, murky swamp water hides predators. A lurk fish. It can't see the octopus in the gloom, but it can sense it. The lurkfish hides in the debris on the bottom and surrounds itself by a weak electric field. The octopus disturbs this field, and the hidden lurkfish detects its movement with special receptors. And when the octopus gets close enough, the lurkfish stuns it with a massive electric shock. Then it can just swallow the octopus, whose powerful venom is no longer a threat.
Electric fish now generate voltage in small blocks, small muscle blocks along the length of the fish. Each generate a small electrical potential. And like batteries in a series, those muscle blocks along the length build up a bigger and bigger charge. Our lurkfish at 4 meters has enough length to generate a huge charge.
It has hundreds of muscle blocks packed in series along its body, and so builds up and releases a discharge of more than 1,000 volts, easily stunning even a large octopus. The swamp is a brutal, competitive world. The evolutionary arms race has escalated here. The lurkfish has found a way around the swampus's deadly bite. But there's a very simple and effective way to avoid being attacked. These are adult toratons. The one killed by the swampers was only a baby. These are 20 times bigger again. So big, the swampers' venom has no effect on them.
The adults are enormous, the biggest animals that have ever walked on the face of the planet. 120 tons. That's bigger than even the biggest dinosaur.
So how, and why, has a tortoise grown so big?
Now, there are lots of advantages about being so big. The first one is that if you're so tall, you can reach into the treetops to eat vegetation from the very tops of the trees. The second is you're so big that few animals can actually eat you. You're too big to be attacked. And the third is that when you're eating all this vegetation, you need to ferment it to get all the goodness out of it. You need an enormous stomach, a big barrel-shaped stomach. And the bigger the animal is, the bigger its stomach's going to be. So it can extract all the goodness out of all the vegetation over several days.
Torotons are so big they don't even notice the nursery plant. One careless kick destroys it. But the baby swampers have already gone. They're old enough to be taken to the water's edge, where they'll learn to feed themselves. But before they drop into the water, the mother draws the lurkfish away, enticing it into deeper water, always staying just out of range of the fish's deadly weapon. Once she's led it far enough from the young, the swampus hides herself in the vegetation, keeps still, and loses the lurkfish. She's bought enough time for the babies to find secure hiding places in this dangerous swamp. A 100 million years is enough time for evolution to create complex relationships in the hot, humid swamp. But there are places on the planet where the results of evolution are even more entwined. Tropical rainforest. And this hothouse world is cloaked in vast, endless forests. These rainforests are packed with life. A rich variety of plants and animals, all jostling to survive in this crowded world. But the strangest thing about this particular rainforest isn't what lives here, but where it is. These rainforests cover what was once the frozen wastes of Antarctica. But Antarctica wasn't always frozen, and it will thaw again, because the continent is on the move. Over the next 100 million years, Antarctica will move off the South Pole and arrive in the tropics, where, eventually, it will be cloaked in lush tropical forest, as it once was in the past. These future forests are filled with life. Birds and insects that look similar to those of today's rainforests. That's because they live in much the same way, occupying similar niches. But some of these creatures have very strange origins. Many of these birds belong to a future group called flutterbirds, and their ancestry is revealed by their strange tubular nostrils.
Now, flutterbirds are immediately recognizable as coming from a group of birds we're familiar with today. They have tube noses. The tube-nosed birds are called the petrels, and they're one of the dominant species in modern Antarctica.
Dozens of different kinds of petrels live on and around Antarctica today, feeding over the ocean, but returning to nest on land. Ocean-going Antarctic seabirds turning into tiny, colourful flutterbirds? It sounds unlikely, but it could happen, because Antarctica will change so slowly that evolution will be able to keep up. As the continent moves north and the ice sheet melts, Antarctica is laid bare for the first time in millions of years. tundra replaces the ice fields. Further north still, and the tundra is replaced by the first forests of conifers. Finally, as the continent reaches the tropics, dense rainforest will spread over the whole of Antarctica. All this time, the petrels have been slowly changing, evolving to fit the new habitats until, finally, they become flutterbirds, adapted for life in the rainforest. There are hundreds of species of flutterbirds here, all living different lifestyles. They can do this because the variation in wing shapes means different flutterbirds can feed in different ways. Long-winged species fly over the forest, while broad-winged species glide under the canopy. And the short, rounded wings of the roach cutter make it very maneuverable, allowing it to twist and turn at speed, snatching insects off the branches as it flies. But some insects in this forest feed on roach cutters. A falconfly is the same size as the bird. How can insects get to be so big?
Today, the size of insects is determined by the richness of oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen is absorbed via little tubes inside the animal, and an insect can only grow so large. If the atmosphere were enriched in oxygen, they could grow bigger. It's happening in the future, but it happened in the past. In the Carboniferous coal swamps, there were huge dragonflies. There were millipede-like animals on the forest floor which were truly terrifying. They could get much larger because of the richer atmosphere. Well, it can happen again in the future, perhaps sufficient to turn an insect into a major predator.
The giant falconfly's weapons include legs that act as spears and sharp jaws to butcher its prey. But the huge insects don't have it all their own way. Evolution doesn't stand still. One flutterbird here has evolved a startling defense against giant insects.
The Spitfire bird has developed an extraordinary way of defending itself against predators. It squirts a hot, noxious fluid from its nose.
It does this by mixing two chemicals from two different storage areas in a special reaction chamber in its tube nose. The chemicals react violently and erupt from its nose as a boiling hot, foul-tasting spray.
It may sound improbable, but among living animals there is the bombardier beetle, which does a similar mixture of two chemicals and produces a really hot spray which repels any predator instantly.
The Spitfire bird's defense depends on its partnership with this rainforest tree. The chemicals are produced by the flowers, but both can't be in the same flower or they'd explode. So there are trees with male and female flowers, each producing one of the chemicals. As the bird visits each in turn to recharge its defenses, it also provides the trees with a first-class pollination service. Spitfire birds and Spitfire trees. A close partnership, but one that can be infiltrated. Some of these flowers are actually camouflaged predatory beetles. But such elaborate deceptions happen today.
Nature is full of camouflage. There are insects which imitate plants, leaves, flowers. The flower mantis, for example, carefully arranges its appendages, its limbs, so that it looks like an orchid.
Looking like a flower is a real advantage for a predatory insect. Your prey comes looking for you. In the future, insects have developed camouflage even further. These beetles cooperate to create the image of the flower. In the competitive world of the rainforest, they've found a clever way round the Spitfire bird's defenses. Spitfire birds only visit flowers when their stocks of chemicals run low and they're relatively defenseless. But there's one more twist in this story. Falconflies have also found that it's safe to grab Spitfire birds feeding on the flowers. And this time, the beetles go hungry. In these crowded forests, animals and plants are linked in a complex web of interrelationships that seems unbelievable. But nothing in these future forests is beyond the scope of evolution.
The thing about evolution is that it occurs by multitudes of small steps over very long periods of time. Any individual step is never very great. But the result, if we're looking at 100 million years worth of time, the result itself can be quite amazing.
Evolution has been stretched to the limit in this stable hothouse world. But 100 million years in the future, it's not just the climate that's different. The geography of the Earth has changed as the continents creep over the globe.
Well, much as India, by colliding into Asia in the present day, has created the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan mountain range as the largest and highest mountain range on the Earth, so too Australia, 100 million years in the future, in its northward journey is ultimately colliding with the southeastern portion of Asia, and indeed pushing up an equivalent to the Himalayas, except potentially even larger in extent.
Eventually, Australia also collides with North America, a continental collision that creates a massive plateau, a vast island in the sky, 10,000 meters above the forests and swamps, 5,000 kilometers from side to side. Life here is run by different rules. It's not so much a battle between species as a battle against harsh conditions. But despite these, the great blue windrunner migrates here every summer. But this is no ordinary bird. To soar over these high-altitude plateaus, the windrunner has 4 wings. The option of using either 2 or 4 wings allows the windrunner to fly in different ways.
It still keeps its 2 wings, which it flaps with, flies rather similar to a modern crane. But when it wants to slow down, it swings its hind legs forward. This increases the area of the wings. That means it's going to fly slower and also fly more cheaply, so it's less expensive to fly, it can go further. This extends its design envelope. It gives it a much bigger range of things it can do.
So the legs have become secondary wings, but they can't be flapped like the forewings. The windrunner still needs the basic skeleton and muscles of the legs so it can stand when it lands. And with this new design, the windrunner is quite at home in the cold, thin air of the plateau. The windrunners come all this way to breed, to rear their single chick on an isolated crag high above the crowded world over 10 kilometers below. And they make the journey because, however barren it looks, there's an almost never-ending supply of food up here. The valleys and ravines shelter huge silver spiders. Unlike the hothouse world below, there aren't many different species on the plateau, but those that do live here exist in vast numbers. There are hundreds of webs here, each 10 meters across, each the work of a whole colony of spiders.
Even today, there are a few spiders that cooperate together. They do so to build larger webs. Spinning silk is rather expensive for body metabolism. So cooperation allows for the spinning of larger webs in a much more efficient way.
These are social black widows, living in groups of a few hundred. Every evening they spread out along lines that radiate from their nest and spin vast webs. But all these spiders are identical. They all share the different tasks with no division of labor.
In 100 million years, spiders have become more social. They've developed different castes. Most of these castes are just based upon age and therefore size.
The youngest and smallest spiders are the line casters that start the new webs. A floating seed head attached to a silken thread makes a kite, carrying the small spider across the ravine, trailing a fine line. With this thin line in place, the larger web builders start work. First, a web builder moves out onto the fine line, trailing a thicker scaffolding line behind it. Other scaffold lines make a framework, and the gaps are filled in by sticky threads. But these webs aren't built to trap insects. Instead, they trap seeds. These clouds of seeds blow into the ravine from the plateau, which in places is covered in grass trees. These bamboo-like plants have gnarled stems that can reach 40 meters in length, trailing over and through the thin soil. And each year, they produce vast quantities of seeds, which are carried over the plateau on parachutes of tassels. Huge numbers of these seeds are caught in the silver spider's web, where another caste collects them and takes them into crevices in the sides of the ravine. This is where most of the colony lives, and where they store their summer harvest of seeds. Even deeper in these crevices is one other caste, the bloated queen, 60 centimeters across. Her only job is to lay eggs, hundreds and hundreds of them, tended by worker spiders. But there's something else here, even more bizarre. Sharing these caves is a small mammal, a poggle, the very last species of mammal alive on Earth. Poggles lead a precarious existence, stealing seeds from the silver spider's granary. But what happened to the rest of the mammals?
Even today, the mammals are doing badly. Many species are going extinct, and over the next few 100,000 years, we're going to lose most of the diversity of the mammals we have today. All that's likely to survive are some of the more successful groups, such as the rodents. And even then, they're not going to have the competitive advantage they've got today, because as the world warms up, other species will adapt and expand, and the advantage that mammals have will become less and less. So within 100 million years or so, they'll virtually be on the point of extinction.
The only mammals left are these tiny rodents, living out their lives on an isolated plateau. They seem to lead a charmed life, surrounded by hundreds of spiders twice their size as they gorge themselves on seeds. But sometimes, it all seems to go horribly wrong. The mood changes, and a spider suddenly attacks and kills a poggle. These small rodents are actually the spider's food. The spiders are farming the poggles. Some are eaten by the colony's workers, but others are dragged into the central chamber to feed the massive queen. Spiders and poggles depend on each other, and they both depend on the annual harvest of grass tree seeds to survive on the plateau. The spiders build their massive webs to collect as many seeds as possible during the brief summer. Then, during the rest of the year, the poggles breed, steadily converting the seeds into more poggles that the spiders can eat. The very last of the mammals, reduced to depending on spiders and only surviving in a competitive world by living out of the mainstream of life on this isolated plateau. For now, the partnership works so well that spiders fill the ravines in their millions. These, in turn, feed the windrunner. It's a simple ecosystem, but a hard one.
The plateau is a harsh environment. There are very few species there. Where they do occur, there's lots of them, but the diversity of species is not very high. That contrasts with the rest of the world. We've had 95 million years of a relatively constant environment. This means very complex food webs have evolved, lots of species interrelationships, very complex ecosystem. And that means the animals are specialized.
But this has serious implications for the future of life on Earth.
And in one sense, it sets a world up for a major disaster, that kind of extraordinarily lengthy period of time of no change. And then any change that's going to occur is probably going to be bad news for a large number of the organisms that are existing at that time.
And such a disaster is about to befall life on Earth. The plateau is frequently shaken by earthquakes. But now they're getting more frequent and stronger. Volcanic activity is also increasing all over the globe. Volcanoes created this hothouse world by filling the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. But volcanoes can also destroy it. Toxic gases acidify the atmosphere and oceans, and dust blots out the light. Whole ecosystems collapse, and vast numbers of species are wiped out in an event called a mass extinction. Such events have happened in the past, and sometimes they're made even worse by outside events. Every few 100 million years, the Earth is hit by a large asteroid. How will life on Earth survive this catastrophe? And what will life be like 100 million years after such a disaster?